El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. El ejército del Ebro, rumba, 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 la. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Una noche el río pasó, ay Carmela, ay Carmela. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Pero nada pueden bombas, rumba, la, rumba, la, rumba, la. Donde sobra corazón, ay Carmela, ay.
Well, I'll just get right into it, I guess. My name is John Peterson. I'm the editor of Socialist Appeal. And I'd also like to thank Michael and Kieran for having this open, comradely exchange of ideas on this very important aspect of world history, the history of the working class. I have a personal interest in this subject. My grandfather was from Teruel in Aragon and ended the Civil War period in Valencia and ended up fleeing afterwards and ended up in Mexico, and through a very circuitous route I ended up here. So I have some personal interest in this whole history, but obviously my main interest is political. Above all, why did it fail? Why did the Spanish Revolution fail? Leon Trotsky once said that the Spanish masses could have made 10 revolutions with the amount of energy and sacrifice that they put into it. But why didn't it succeed? In my opinion, the problem was the lack of a far-sighted revolutionary leadership. And that's the short answer. I'll get more into that a little bit later. Now, everybody has their criticisms of this or that group in the revolution. But I think we can all agree that everybody made some mistakes, some very important, some major errors. And in a lot of ways, studying the Spanish Revolution is a study of what not to do in a revolution. But the consequences of defeat, of course, were terrible. We ended up with fascism and dictatorship for decades. Ultimately, World War II was a result of the defeat of the Spanish Revolution. And the failure to learn from those mistakes also led to other things like Chile in 1973. And countless other examples where those kinds of mistakes were made. But the point isn't to point fingers at people. The point is to learn from this experience, because it is relevant today, and not just in places like Venezuela, where I think there's really important parallels, but also ultimately for the revolution that we're going to see in this country in the not too distant future. So we need to learn from this accumulated experience of the working class, which we've been accumulating very painfully since at least 1848. And we don't want to repeat these mistakes too many more times. The first thing I think we need to understand is that a revolution is a process. It's not a single act. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's an ebb and flow. It's a process. It's a very complex process. And over the course of the roughly 8 years of the Spanish Revolution, you had periods of reaction, periods of advance, periods of retreat. Of course, you had, throughout this sort of constant situation of rising dual power and this conflict between the forces in the Republic and then ultimately against the forces of fascism. And in order to understand the Trotskyist position in relation to the Spanish Revolution, I think we first have to understand the character of the revolution. Now, and I think in order to understand the character of the Spanish Revolution, and in order to understand the revolutions that we're seeing, for example, in Latin America today, we have to understand Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, which basically explains that the democratic tasks of the revolution, the tasks that were accomplished, for example, in England or in France hundreds of years ago by the capitalist class, by the bourgeoisie, nowadays they can't be accomplished by the capitalist class because they've come on the scene of history too late. They're too tied to the multinational imperialists. They're too tied to the landlords, and they can't carry out these basic progressive tasks like this, distribution of the land to the peasants and things like that. And therefore, the only force in society that can resolve these tasks is the working class. But even to make those modest reforms, these basic democratic reforms, the workers and the peasants run into the limits of private property, i.e. they run into the limits of capitalism, and they therefore have to surpass the limits of bourgeois democracy, of the capitalist system, and pass on to the socialist tasks, such as nationalizing the banks, taking over the factories under workers' control, and so on. There's no such thing as a progressive bourgeoisie nowadays. I know there's a lot of people, ironically enough, even in this country, think that there's a progressive wing of the capitalist class. But the fact is, the interests of the working class, the vast majority of society, and the interests of the capitalists are 100% opposed, and you can't possibly reconcile them. It's like trying to square the circle. And that's why, in my opinion, and I think the experience of the Spanish Revolution bears out, that only the working class can lead the rest of the oppressed layers of society towards actually resolving the problems that they face. And of course, you can't build socialism in just one country, so the revolution is permanent, going back to Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, in the sense that it can't limit itself to one country, but must go become an international revolution. Now this is as compared to the theory of two stages, the two-stage theory of revolution, which says that first we'll have the sort of democratic revolution, and then we'll worry about at some point in the future about the socialist revolution. Now this kind of a theory where you believe that there is a progressive bourgeoisie, where you believe that you first have to complete this stage and then we'll worry about the next stage, the socialist stage, leads you ultimately to the formations of things like the Popular Front, like we saw in Spain, and like we saw in Chile, and like we've seen in country after country. And the Popular Front, of course, what that means, it sounds nice, maybe on paper, everybody together, but in a Popular Front, by definition, you have capitalists in this government, and also the workers. But since the capitalist system is the dominant system at this stage in time, this means that you're subordinating the interests of the working class to the interests of the capitalists. And this ultimately then paralyzes the working class from being able to act in its own interests. This was a policy that was carried out basically by all the forces in Spain in the 1930s, from the socialists to the communists, the anarchists, the POUM. And ultimately what it means is that since we're in the stage of the democratic revolution, and we have to defend private property, because private property is sacred, private property is the foundation of capitalism. We can't touch that yet because that comes later. We'll worry about that later. But so mistakes in theory will lead to very important mistakes then in practice and have tragic consequences. So then to sum up, the two programs that were being proposed in Spain, the two different options that the Republic had, especially after Franco's uprising, was to preserve capitalist property forms and still try and defeat Franco, or to abolish private property and to conduct a revolutionary war led by the working class in order to smash fascism. Now, unfortunately, the former is what happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. A couple of concrete mistakes of these tactical and strategic mistakes that were made that led to even bigger problems in practice. Now, one of the tasks is in the middle of a revolution, of course, is how do you connect the ideas and program of revolutionary Marxism with the masses? How do you become a mass force? And in order to convert a small group of people, because at the beginning of this process, the Trotskyists in Spain were a very, very small group. In 1930, 1931, they were a very small group, and their task then was how can they connect their ideas, the ideas of Trotsky as against the Communist International, as against Stalinism, how could they convert that into a major force within Spain? And in order to do that, it's important to orient to the traditional organizations of the working class, where the workers are, where they're fighting, even if these organizations might be, the leadership of these organizations, as we've seen, the leadership of all these organizations were extremely reformist. They were all in favor of class collaboration, but the rank and file were extremely radicalized and looking for ideas and very willing to make tremendous sacrifices for all of this. So in 1931, Trotsky suggested to the Spanish Trotskyists, who were led by this guy named Andreu Nin. They were part of the international left opposition, or Andrés Nin, as he's called in Spanish, suggested that they orient to the Young Socialists. Now, the Young Socialists, again, the Socialist Party of Spain, which is a reformist party, the Young Socialists, it was over 100,000 young people, most of them armed, and they came asking for ideas, asking for theory, asking to get organized, asking to learn about revolutionary Marxism. Now, Nin rejected this, basically on principle, because the Socialist Party were the traitors of World War I, etc., and they wanted nothing to do with it. And what ended up happening was that the Stalinists, the Communist Party, who had a very small base actually in Spain at that time, they did take advantage of that opportunity. They ended up taking over the Young Socialists, that group, and gaining tremendous influence among these tens of thousands of armed young people in a very dynamic situation. So that was a major mistake and a major turning point, and that was as early as 1931. Another mistake, a major mistake, is if you mistake the character of the revolution. What are the tasks of the revolution? Is this a revolution to establish a kinder, gentler capitalist republic, or is it a socialist revolution? That, of course, determined the character of the war and the Civil War. Because Civil War, above all, ultimately, is an extension of the class war. It's open war between the classes. Now, a popular front, by definition, cannot wage a war against capitalism. How can a government that includes capitalists fight capitalism? Now, fascism, and because, as was explained, these folks were more afraid of the armed workers, ultimately, than they were of the fascist reaction. Now, fascism is a form of bourgeois reaction. Fascism is a form of rotting, decrepit capitalism. So how can you fight against capitalism with more capitalism? The point is that in order to fight against fascism, what was required were the methods of the working class. And what are these methods? Now, these are strikes, these are factory occupations and workers' control, the formation of workers' militias, and ultimately the formation of councils, of democratically elected committees, whether you call them Soviets, which is the Russian word for them, or juntas, which is a word that was thrown about, or whether they're factory committees that are then expanded to include other layers of the population, not just trade unionists, but the peasants and and the other oppressed layers of society. Forming these, that's the ultimate tool of struggle for the working class against fascism. And ultimately, again, since this is a civil war is a social war, it's a class war, the main method for carrying out a civil war is to fight for the social transformation. In other words, not just we have to militarily defeat Franco, but in order to militarily defeat him, we have to defeat the economic base on which he rests, which is capitalism. In other words, the land needs to go to the peasants, the factories need to go to the workers, the oppressed nationalities need to be given the right to self-determination. Same goes for Morocco at that time. And there's, that was a really important aspect of all of this. But the bourgeois, the capitalist republic, did not want to do these things. And so they didn't do it. But as Trotsky explained, the peasant will not defend the landlord's land. The worker will not defend the boss's factory. They'll defend their land, their collectivized land. They'll defend their factory, but they're not going to defend, the old property relations. They're not going to sacrifice so much in order to go back to the same status quo as before. Now, instinctively, the masses tried to carry out this program. There were these massive, takeovers of landlord's land and collectivization. They were even more advanced, as was said, than in the Russian Revolution in 1917, in the beginning stages, where they collectivized the land, where factories were taken over and run under workers' control. But at every stage, they were stopped by the leadership of their organizations, whether it's the leaders of the CNT, the leaders of the POUM, and of course the leaders in the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and so on. So what was lacking in order to bring all this together, to bring all that instinctive striving of the masses to transform their lives, was a revolutionary party, like I said before, armed with a scientific worked out program and with a clear understanding of what class interests were involved in this struggle and what had to be done decisively in that situation. Now, ultimately, as was explained, the Stalinists ended up getting control. The revolution in Spain was a threat, ultimately, to the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. They wanted to make deals with the English and the French in order to come to some kind of agreement against Hitler at this time. This was before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. They wanted to assure the Western powers that they weren't trying to make a world revolution. They cut all these deals, and they ultimately became the biggest defenders of private property and ultimately the biggest stranglers of the revolution as part of that popular front. So above all, the failure then was the failure of the workers' leadership. Which was the leadership? I know we might have some disagreements about amongst folks here about whether leadership is good or bad or whatever, but the leadership existed, and the workers were looking for that leadership, and that leadership should have been elected and accountable by the workers, and then ultimately they should have had a clear program for the socialist transformation in order to wage a revolutionary war against fascism. By rejecting the struggle for power, there was an anecdote that was explained, and the conundrum that they were in, and all these pressures about do we take the power, do we not take the power, whatever. By not fighting for power, and these leaders, the leaders of the CNT, had a lot of influence. The POUM, not as much, but they were equally guilty, in my opinion, of not taking these decisive steps. They could have mobilized the workers, because if you don't contest power, if you don't fight for power, you end up leaving power in the hands of those that already have it. If you don't expand the struggle, not just to your front, the POUM and the CNT sort of looked out for their battlefront, their sort of workers, their union, their this. I mean, they all kind of isolated themselves from the broader masses. Like they said, many other workers were in other unions. Many other workers, the workers in the fascist-occupied territories, they needed to know that what they were fighting for, that they should rise up against the fascists in their lands, was because they were going to get the land, they were going to get the factories. Why should they fight against Franco if the Republic wasn't going to give them much else? And that was one of the things that the fascists would yell across, or even just the conscript troops would yell at the POUM or the anarchist troops. They'd say, well, what has the Republic done for you? During the days that the workers had basically risen up in May of 1937, when they had, as Kieran said, power in their hands, they controlled the factories, they controlled the land and everything, they had the barricades, they had the arms, who was gonna dislodge them? The only people that could have possibly dislodged them were their own leaders. And when they said, hey, can we all get along, everybody go back to work, that was basically the last big missed opportunity in that process. Finally, well, I got a few things here. I just wanted to say just a couple. Do you have a few minutes? Sure, a couple minutes. Just a little bit about the POUM in particular, since we've talked about some other groups. A lot of people call them the Trotskyists, but I wouldn't call them necessarily the Trotskyists. There were Trotskyists in the POUM, but the POUM was actually the fusion of two different groups that existed in Spain, at least since the early 1930s. The communist left of Spain, which was sort of part of Trotsky's left opposition internationally, and then the workers and peasants bloc, which was actually part of the right opposition against Stalin around people like Bukharin, for those of you that know all these names and words. So Trotsky was actually opposed to this fusion. He was opposed to because they basically both represented different viewpoints. The BOC were actually Catalan nationalists. The ICE, the people under Nin, they had rejected, like I said earlier, they had rejected orienting to the Socialist Party in principle, and yet they were willing to fuse with this other group, which had much more important disagreements and without having a real mass base. But nonetheless, Trotsky did call the POUM the most honest organization, but it wasn't really a revolutionary Bolshevik organization. It was a centrist organization, which means that it vacillated between revolutionary Marxism and left reformism. They talked a lot about revolution in words, but in deeds they collaborated with the Popular Front. They ended up isolating themselves from the masses, and they ended up being chopped down by the GPU. Andrei Nin was captured. This leader, former personal friend of Trotsky's, was tortured and murdered and killed by the Stalinists. So ultimately, I'll sum up with this, although there's more to say. I'll just say that this centrist vacillation between reformism and revolution is what ultimately led, in my opinion, to the demise of the Spanish Revolution, because you can't make half a revolution. Just like you can't cross the road halfway. If you cross the road halfway, eventually you're going to get hit by an oncoming truck. And by not taking the revolution to its conclusion, by not disbanding the old capitalist state and building from below a workers' state and actually implementing workers' control and converting the civilian factories to arms factories in the Republican areas, which would have at that point then, if they'd gone through with this, would have been controlled by the working class. They could have had the arms. They wouldn't have had to rely on arms from the Soviet Union. They did have the potential, in my opinion, had they waged a revolutionary war to defeat fascism, and history would have been very different, as was mentioned already. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you. It's a question of what kind of leadership was there, and a lack of clarity, a lack of clearness of program that could connect with the masses, like I said, both in the Republic and in the areas occupied by Franco. And that audacity, I believe, would come through having confidence in your ideas, having confidence in the working class ultimately being able to make these huge changes in their own lives, which instinctively, I think, frankly, that the rank and file were 1,000 times more revolutionary than the so-called leadership. But the leadership, because of the fact that it was supposedly the leadership, did hold them back. Did have, like you said, they didn't want to give up the guns. They didn't want to tear down the barricades, and yet they were disciplined. This was their leaders telling them this. So they did it, and they ended up paying dearly for it. What you have happening then is you have, as you said, not just anarchists and Pumas and so on becoming part of the Popular Front government, but you have them becoming representatives of an alien class, of the capitalist class within the workers' movement itself, a transmission belt to allow that state to reestablish itself, that capitalist state to reestablish itself by serving as the policemen ultimately of the capitalist class itself. So I do believe that that carrying out audaciously that revolutionary program to expropriate the land, to collectivize the land, to take over the factories, to nationalize them, that would have won people. I mean, if you look at, for example, the American Civil War, it was really a stalemate for a long time. I mean, the Civil War, in my conception, was a confrontation between the capitalist North and the slave-owning South. Two completely different socioeconomic systems that were incompatible with each other, and then ended up coming to civil war in order to establish, to reconcile those contradictions between those two social systems. But it wasn't until Lincoln emancipated the slaves that the war actually became a revolutionary war for the transformation of the social foundations of the South, that then the North really was able to defeat them. I mean, militarily, the North should have been able to kick the South's but pretty easily. I mean, the economy of New York was 4 times larger than the entire South. I mean, militarily, they had the capacity. But until they took that step of actually turning it into a revolutionary war, they weren't able to carry it out. Same with Napoleon after the French Revolution. Why was Napoleon able to kick so many kings and monarchs' armies? It's because he was basing himself on bringing capitalist property forms against feudal property forms, freeing the serfs. I mean, that's a pretty powerful way to get the locals to support you. If you say, we're going to free. It wasn't because Napoleon was a good guy, but that's the property form that he based his power on, capitalist property in France, and was able to wage a war. So the same thing goes for that. If in the Republic, in the areas held by the Republic, which were the majority of Spain, Franco's forces were repelled at first. If they had carried out these measures, like I said, land to the peasants, factories to the workers, if they had freed Morocco or even just granted autonomy, the leader of the Moroccan resistance movement came to Madrid and offered to support the Republic and a lot of the troops were Moroccan, by the way. A lot of Franco's troops were Moroccan. He offered, if you will offer us autonomy, we will support you, and that would have cut a huge base of support. Same goes for offering the right of self-determination to the Basques or to the Catalans. Although those were areas that were already with the Republic, but the Republic just said no, we can't do that to Morocco, even just autonomy. And what ended up happening later on was Franco, the fascist, ended up granting freedom to Morocco later on. Why? Because he was threatened by the threat of, by the threat of revolt. But I mean, so the Republic was so cowardly in carrying out even modest social measures like autonomy for people on another continent, that they lost that potential to have that base of support that could have undermined them. So I do think it was a matter of, even if people had the best of intentions, if it isn't all brought together and linked up with a clear, conscious program, then there's a lot of confusion that reigns. And as someone who follows the Venezuelan revolution very carefully, there's a lot of parallels, like I said at the beginning, with the long, protracted, confused process that's taking place in Venezuela that we can see the tragic results of in Spain in the 1930s. I think Kieran raises a great question. Why the Popular Front? If the point was to, the theory behind the Popular Front is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If you get the socialists and the communists and the anarchists and the liberal capitalists and all these people all together, they'll make up a greater than the sum of their parts, and they'll be able to fight fascism better. But when all those disparate groups have opposing interests, or not all of them, but at least the two main poles. You got the capitalists, the so-called liberal capitalists on one side, and all the workers' organizations on the other, pulling in completely different directions. Then you don't have a force greater than the sum of its parts. You have a neutralization of all that potential force. And as they say, a spoonful of tar can ruin a barrel full of honey. And in the barrel of honey of the workers' organizations, you put this spoonful of tar. It wrecked the whole thing, frankly. So why not a united front of the workers' organizations to fight using the working class methods of struggle, which I described earlier, against the fascists? Why introduce this alien force? Now the reason is, of course, that we've been told. The reason people fell for this, we've been told for decades and decades and decades that, this is how things are. This is the sort of government we have. This is the kind of military structure we have. This is the kind of way that we wage war. But in a revolution, it's everything's turned upside down. And like I said, what was required was a revolutionary war, and not trying to replicate, not trying to fight. Like you said, you can't fight capitalism with capitalism. And we saw the examples of that in Italy and Germany and Austria and Spain, ultimately, that the so-called methods of the democracies don't work. They didn't work, and the working class paid for it. Just a couple quick points. Two is just to recommend a couple of movies to people that are kind of deal with some of these questions. Of course, the main movie in relation to Spain would be Land and Freedom, really good movie by Ken Loach, which I think people should check out. But also the movie 1900 by Bertolucci about the Italian Revolution. You see these stages, this process, the revolutionary process, the moment when the workers and the peasants and the socialists and Trotskyists and the anarchists and everybody rise up and they've got power in their hands and they don't know what to do with it. So they go back home and they turn in their guns, and then it's really tragic, and then the final line practically of the movie is the boss is back, literally, and that opportunity was wasted, and of course then we had to live through World War II as a result of that failure. So 1900 by Bertolucci, very cool movie, deals with a lot of these issues. And then just finally, if the Popular Front had won, again, what would have changed? You still would have had capitalists, you still would have had landlords, and the people just weren't willing to fight for that. And that's, I think, a really big reason for it. And just one last anecdote. Is in another movie, I guess, have you guys seen Pan's Labyrinth? That movie deals with this period of the post-Spanish Revolution. And we're told in the United States that D-Day took place because we had to fight fascism. And all these brave American farm boys went and risked their lives and died by droves in order to fight fascism. But if they were really fighting fascism and not trying to stop the advance of the Soviet Union, which is the real goal in my opinion, why didn't, after they got into Normandy, why didn't they head west down into Spain? Why did they leave fascism in power for decades after that if they were fighting fascism? That's just another anecdote. Well, just briefly on the tasks in Spain versus in the U.S. versus Spain, I think what are the similarities? I think it's just very clear here. In Spain, because it was 70% peasant country, although there were really important industrial centers and a strong working class in certain areas, and although millions of the rural workers were agricultural laborers, they weren't real peasants, they didn't own any land whatsoever at all, so they had more of a working class almost psychology in some ways, even though they lived in rural areas. In this country, it's 100% clear what the tasks are. There's no question. Do we have to have a kinder, gentler democracy in the United States? That argument, carried a little weight in Spain, where you had a monarchy up until 1931. People could say, okay, well, the next stage now must be democracy, like in France or something like that. In this country, we have the most perfect democracy that, as they say, money can buy already. So it's clear that the tasks here are socialist tasks. That is, we see the crisis of the system itself. We have the overwhelming majority of the United States are working class people, whether you work in a factory or you work at a call center or you work at, I mean, we're all workers. We sell our labor power for a wage to a capitalist. We don't live off stock actions or government bailouts. And it's clear what those tasks are. And I would say, in my opinion, that what we need is to develop that revolutionary leadership in advance, not a party above the class by any means, but part of the class. Anybody who's read the Communist Manifesto, which if you haven't read it, you should at least read so you can at least critique it from your own perspective if you don't agree with it, understands that what's argued for in there is that the communists be the most advanced sector of the working class, not something separate or apart or alien from it. And that's what I think we need to be building here. Obviously building ties with the working class in the trade unions, with unorganized workers, obviously, as well. Immigrant workers, I think that's a really important movement everybody should be involved in. But you can see the bubbling up, the simmering discontent in this country, more and more coming to the surface. And I believe it will be sooner rather than later that we will have huge opportunities in this country. And the more we prepare now, the better prepared we'll be in order to take advantage of that situation, and so that people 70 years from now, if human society even can survive that long under capitalism, they don't have a meeting at some similar bookstore talking about what not to do in the American Revolution in the future. So
thank you all very much for coming, and we would all be happy to stay around and continue our discussion. There is a list of books on the back of the handout that I gave you, but it's only a partial list of stuff I pulled off of my bookshelf. There are a lot of great books over there on the table as well that Mayday is interested in selling you. And thank you again also for your questions and your time.